January 17th, 1943. 23,000 feet above Rabaul, New Britain. The air is thin here, crystalline and cold. Lieutenant Saburō Sakai feels the familiar bite of altitude through his leather gloves as he banks his Mitsubishi A6M0 into a climbing turn, the morning sun breaking through scattered cumulus like molten gold poured across the Pacific sky. Below, the volcanic peaks of New Britain rise dark and primal from seas that shimmer with impossible blue. The engine hums its familiar song, a sound he has trusted for 2 years, through China, through the Philippines, through the early triumphant months when the rising sun seemed destined to illuminate all of Asia. At this altitude, Sakai knows, he is untouchable. The Zero climbs like no other fighter in the world. It turns like a hunting falcon. In these heights, he is not merely a pilot, he is an extension of bushidō itself, samurai spirit given wings and speed. He scans the horizon with the methodical precision of a man who has survived 128 combat missions. The scattered patrol flights of Allied bombers have been growing bolder lately, probing the defensive perimeter around Rabaul with increasing frequency. But boldness, Sakai has learned, is not the same as capability. The Americans fly their heavy, lumbering machines in tight formations, relying on mass rather than grace. They are wealthy in numbers but poor in spirit. Also, the commanders tell the pilots during evening briefings. Victory, they say, belongs not to those with the most resources, but to those with the purest will. Then he sees them, 8 shapes emerging from a cloud bank to the southeast, still climbing. The silhouette is unfamiliar, stubby, thick-bodied, ungainly. Not the twin-boomed lightnings he has duelled before, nor the angular wildcats that the Americans threw against the Zero in those early desperate days. These aircraft look almost comically bulky, as if some engineer had prioritized armor and ammunition over every principle of aerial elegance. Sakai notes their altitude with professional interest, 20,000 feet and rising. He banks slightly, positioning himself above them with the sun at his back, preparing for the bounce that has served him so well in 2 years of combat. The advantage of altitude is absolute in fighter combat. Height converts to speed, speed to position, position to victory. He will dive through their formation, select the trailing aircraft, deliver a precise burst from his twin 20mm cannon, and climb away before they can react. It is a ballet he has performed dozens of times. But something is wrong. The American formation does not waver or scatter at his approach. They continue climbing, their rate of ascent steady and somehow insolent. Sakai pushes his stick forward, beginning his attack dive, his Zero accelerating with the gravitational assist of 3,000 feet of altitude. The airspeed indicator climbs past 250 knots. He selects his target, the rightmost aircraft in the formation, and begins to calculate deflection angle, his hands and mind moving with the unconscious precision of ritual. And then the American fighters simply climb away from him. Not with panic, not with evasive action. They just continue ascending, their rate of climb impossible, unnatural, as if the laws of aerodynamics that have governed air combat since Richthofen's day have been suspended by some technological sorcery. Sakai pulls out of his dive and hauls his stick back, climbing after them, his engine screaming with effort. The Zero shudders as he trades speed for altitude, the controls growing mushy as the wings fight for purchase, in air growing ever thinner. At 24,000 feet he levels off, breathing hard, his vision narrowing slightly from hypoxia despite his training. The Zeros can reach 30,000 feet in theory, but at these heights the aircraft becomes sluggish, unresponsive, more glider than fighter. The American aircraft are now at 26,000 feet, still climbing, their formations perfect and unbroken. For the first time in his combat career, Saburō Sakai understands that he is looking at something beyond his reach. This is the moment when the mythology begins to crack. To understand the shock that rippled through Sakai's consciousness in those frozen seconds above Rabaul, one must first understand what the Zero represented, not merely as a machine, but as an ideological statement cast in aluminum and aviation fuel. When the Mitsubishi A6M entered service in 1940, it was, by every measurable standard, the finest carrier-based fighter aircraft in the world. Its maximum range exceeded 1,700 miles. Its rate of climb was extraordinary. Its turning radius was so tight that Allied pilots who survived encounters with it reported that the Zero seemed to pivot in place, as if physics itself bent to accommodate Japanese engineering. In the opening months of the Pacific War, Zero pilots achieved kill ratios that bordered on the fantastical, 10-1, 20-1. In the skies over Pearl Harbor, Clark Field, Singapore, and Darwin, the Zero seemed less an aircraft than a verdict. Japan had not merely caught up with Western aviation technology, but had surpassed it. This supremacy was not accidental. It emerged from a design philosophy that prized mobility and range above all else. Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero's chief designer, made systematic decisions to strip away every ounce of unnecessary weight. The Zero carried no armor plating to protect its pilot. Its fuel tanks were unprotected, vulnerable to even glancing strikes from machine gun fire. Its airframe was built light, sacrificing structural strength for aerodynamic efficiency. These were not oversights. They were conscious choices rooted in a warrior tradition that valued offensive capability over defensive preparation, attack over survival. The samurai, after all, did not wear armor when facing death. He accepted mortality as the price of honor. The Zero embodied this ethos in every rivet and strut, and for 2 years, it worked. Sakai himself was living proof of the Zero's supremacy. Born in 1916 to a family of modest means in Saga Prefecture, he had joined the Imperial Japanese Navy at 16, driven by the same economic desperation that filled military ranks across the industrializing world. Flight training was brutal, designed to winnow out all but the most capable and committed. Of 70 students in Sakai's class, only 25 graduated. The training emphasized not just technical skill but spiritual preparation. Pilots were expected to embody the warrior virtues of courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice. When Sakai earned his wings in 1937, he became part of an elite brotherhood that saw itself as the inheritors of a tradition stretching back through centuries of samurai history. By the time he climbed into that Zero over Rabaul in January 1943, Sakai had personally shot down more than 60 Allied aircraft. His name was spoken with respect even among enemy pilots. He had survived wounds that would have killed lesser men. Just months earlier, a bullet had destroyed his right eye during a mission over Guadalcanal, yet he had flown his damaged Zero 300 miles back to base with one eye gone and his head wound streaming blood into the cockpit. This was the caliber of man flying the Zero. This was the spirit that Japanese commanders believed would compensate for any material disadvantage. But spirit, Sakai discovered that day over Rabaul, cannot overcome thermodynamics. The aircraft climbing past him with such insulting ease was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and it represented everything the Zero was not. Where the Zero was graceful, the Thunderbolt was brutish. Where the Zero was light, just 4,000 pounds empty, the Thunderbolt weighed nearly 10,000 pounds without fuel or ammunition. The Zero's engine produced barely 1,000 horsepower. The Thunderbolt's 18-cylinder radial engine generated 2,000 horsepower, and with its turbo-supercharger fully engaged at altitude, it could maintain full power at heights, where the Zero's engine gasped for oxygen. The Thunderbolt carried 8 50-caliber machine guns. Its pilot sat in an armoured cockpit protected by bulletproof glass and steel plate. Its wings and fuselage could absorb damage that would have torn a Zero apart. More than that, the P-47 was the product of an entirely different industrial philosophy. America did not ask its pilots to choose between survival and mission capability. It did not romanticize sacrifice. It built aircraft the way it built everything else during the war, with overwhelming material resources, systematic engineering, and a democratic premise that individual human life possessed intrinsic value worth protecting. The Thunderbolt was not elegant, but elegance was not the point. The point was to bring the pilot home, alive after completing the mission. Sakai, circling uselessly below the American formation that January day, understood none of this intellectual context. What he understood was visceral and immediate. The weapon that had made him invincible was now obsolete. The advantage that Japanese pilots had wielded like a katana for 2 years had been not merely matched but surpassed by machines that operated according to entirely different principles. The Americans had not tried to build a better Zero. They had rendered the Zero's strengths irrelevant. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Japanese fighter doctrine had been built entirely around the Zero's performance envelope. Tactics emphasize climbing to altitude, using superior maneuverability to enter turning dogfights, and relying on pilot skill and aggression to secure victory. These tactics worked magnificently against the early war American fighters, the stubby Brewster Buffaloes, the outclassed P-40 Warhawks. They worked less well against the F-4F Wildcats that the Navy fielded, but Wildcat pilots had to fight defensively, using diving attacks and refusing to enter sustained dogfights. The Zero still held the tactical initiative, but the P-47 changed everything. It could outclimb the Zero above 20,000 feet. It could outdive the Zero at any altitude. The Thunderbolt's robust airframe allowed it to exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive, speeds that would tear the lightly built Zero's wings off. It could absorb punishment that would doom a Zero, and perhaps most critically, it could ignore the Zero's greatest strength. P-47 pilots simply refused to turn with the Zero. They used their altitude advantage to dive through Japanese formations, firing devastating bursts from their 8 heavy machine guns, then climbing back to altitude on pure engine power. If a Zero tried to follow, the Thunderbolt would simply point its nose skyward and climb away, its turbo supercharger maintaining full power, while the Zero's engine choked on thin air. The tactical term for this was boom and zoom, but that clinical phrase obscures the psychological dimension of the experience. For Zero pilots trained to see air combat as a test of individual warrior spirit, this new American approach felt like cowardice. The P-47 pilots would not stand and fight like honorable opponents. They refused to engage in the turning dogfights that showcased Zero superiority. They used brute mechanical advantage rather than skill. It felt fundamentally unfair, an American industrial trick that sidestepped the purity of combat. But fairness, as Sakai was learning, was not an operational consideration. War is not a tournament governed by rules of honor. It is a contest of systems, political, industrial, technological, logistical. Japan had trained perhaps the finest individual fighter pilots in the world and equipped them with an aircraft perfectly optimized for the combat environment of 1940. But by 1943, the environment had changed. The Americans had adapted their tactics to exploit their material strengths and negate Japanese advantages. They had done so not through superior warrior spirit, but through systematic industrial production and pragmatic engineering. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1941, the United States produced 5,088 military aircraft. In 1942, that number rose to 47,936. By 1943, the year Sakai encountered the Thunderbolts over Rabaul, American factories produced 85,198 military aircraft. Japan, by contrast, produced 8,161 military aircraft in 1943. This was not a gap that pilot skill or warrior spirit could bridge. The Americans could afford to lose aircraft and pilots in training accidents, in operational mishaps, in combat, and replace them faster than Japan could destroy them. Every Zero that went down took with it hundreds of hours of pilot training and irreplaceable combat experience. Every P-47 that returned to base, no matter how damaged, preserved its pilot to fight again. Sakai circled his Zero at 24,000 feet, watching the American formation continue its patrol at altitudes he could not reach, and felt the first cold touch of a thought he had never before entertained. Japan might lose this war. The symbolic weight of this encounter extended far beyond individual combat. The P-47 Thunderbolt was, in every rivet and cylinder, an expression of American industrial democracy. It was heavy because America could afford the aluminum and steel. It was powerful because American factories could mass-produce complex 18-cylinder radial engines with turbo superchargers, a technological sophistication beyond Japanese manufacturing capacity at scale. It was heavily armed because American logistics could deliver unlimited 50-caliber ammunition to forward bases. It protected its pilot because American political culture valued individual survival over abstract notions of warrior honor. This last point represents perhaps the deepest philosophical chasm between the American and Japanese approaches to air warfare. Japanese military culture, rooted in centuries of samurai tradition, viewed the warrior's willingness to die as not merely acceptable, but as the highest expression of service. The ultimate honor was to die in combat for the emperor. Pilots who returned from missions where they might have sacrificed themselves faced quiet disapproval. The most celebrated Japanese warriors were those who died gloriously. The kamikaze pilots of late 1944 and 1945 represented the logical endpoint of this thinking, where the pilot himself became the weapon. His death not a tragic cost, but the mission's objective. American military culture, forged in a democratic society where individual rights were foundational political principles, rejected this entire framework. The ideal American warrior was not the man who died gloriously, but the man who completed his mission and came home. The entire American industrial mobilization effort aimed at this goal: give the soldier, sailor, or airman the tools and support necessary to achieve victory while maximizing their chances of survival. The P-47's armor plating was not a concession to cowardice, but an acknowledgement that trained pilots were valuable assets worth protecting. The heavy armament was not excess but insurance. Pilots needed overwhelming firepower to ensure they could destroy the enemy decisively and escape before taking crippling damage. This philosophical difference manifested in every aspect of aircraft design. The Zero's unprotected fuel tanks saved weight, but meant that a single incendiary bullet could turn the entire aircraft into a fireball. American pilots who survived Zero encounters reported that the Japanese fighter burned beautifully, a grim phrase that captured both the Zero's vulnerability and the horror of watching enemy pilots die in flames. The P-47's self-sealing fuel tanks, by contrast, were rubber-lined with layers that would swell when punctured by bullets, automatically closing small holes and preventing fuel leakage. This technology added weight and complexity, but it saved lives. American pilots who returned to base with fuel tanks shot full of holes did not consider themselves lucky. They considered themselves properly equipped. The symbolic object that recurs throughout Sakai's later accounts of this period is not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but something more mundane and yet more profound: food. In his memoir, Samurai, written decades after the war, Sakai describes the gradual deterioration of rations at Rabaul as American submarines strangled Japanese supply lines. By early 1943, pilots were subsisting on rice mixed with weevils, occasional fish, and whatever local fruits they could scavenge. Weight loss was universal. Energy levels dropped. The physical demands of flying high-performance fighters at extreme altitudes, pulling sustained G-forces in combat maneuvers, operating in unpressurized cockpits at heights where oxygen deprivation was constant, required substantial caloric intake and proper nutrition. Japanese pilots increasingly lacked both. Meanwhile, American pilots at forward bases ate from an abundance that would have seemed fantastical to their Japanese counterparts. The American military logistics system, unprecedented in human history, delivered not just ammunition and fuel, but fresh eggs, canned meat, bread, coffee, cigarettes, candy bars. American pilots complained about the monotony of their rations, a complaint that would have struck Japanese pilots as obscene, a grievance from another universe. The American supply chain represented the same industrial philosophy that built the P-47, overwhelming material advantage systematically deployed. An army travels on its stomach, Napoleon observed, and the American military moved on a logistical infrastructure of such scale that it could deliver ice cream to tropical islands, where Japanese soldiers were starving. This was not incidental. It was fundamental. The P-47 climbing past Sakai's Zero that day over Rabaul was not just an aircraft. It was the physical manifestation of an industrial democracy's capacity to project power. Every pound of armor plate, every cylinder of that massive radial engine, every round of .50 caliber ammunition represented factories in America working 3 shifts, ships crossing the Pacific with supplies, oil refineries in Texas and California producing aviation fuel by the tanker load. The Zero was a masterpiece of efficient engineering, optimized to overcome resource constraints. The P-47 was a statement that resource constraints did not exist, that America could afford to build fighters that weighed twice as much as necessary if those extra pounds brought pilots home alive. The transformation in Sakai's thinking did not occur in a single moment, but that encounter over Rabaul marked the beginning. Over the following months, the pattern repeated with increasing frequency. American fighters appeared at altitudes the Zero could not effectively reach. They attacked with tactics the Zero could not counter. When Zero pilots did manage to score hits, they watched in frustration as the American aircraft absorbed damage that would have been catastrophic to their own machines and continued flying. The psychological toll was insidious. The confidence born of 2 years of air superiority began to erode, replaced first by frustration, then by something darker, a creeping sense that the fundamental assumptions underlying Japanese strategy were flawed. The documentary evidence from this period reveals the systematic nature of American tactical evolution. Intelligence reports captured after the war show that American commanders had studied Zero performance exhaustively, using captured aircraft to understand its capabilities and limitations. They trained pilots specifically to avoid the Zero's strengths, its turning ability, its low-speed maneuverability, and exploit its weaknesses. The Thatch Weave, a tactical formation developed by Navy Commander John Thatch, allowed pairs of American fighters to cover each other, preventing Zeros from isolating individual aircraft in turning dogfights. The emphasis on altitude and speed, never dogfight with the Zero, became doctrine. This systematic approach extended to aircraft development. The P-47 was not an accident or a lucky design. It was the product of American engineers analyzing the requirements for air superiority and designing an aircraft to meet those requirements without being constrained by resource limitations. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine that powered the Thunderbolt was itself a marvel of engineering, combining 18 cylinders in a 2-row radial configuration with a turbo supercharger system that maintained power output at high altitude. Developing and mass-producing such engines required an industrial base of extraordinary sophistication. Tool and die makers, metallurgists, electrical engineers, all working within an integrated manufacturing system. Japan possessed brilliant engineers and designers. The Zero itself proved that. But Japan lacked the industrial depth to produce complex aircraft systems at scale, while simultaneously prosecuting a war across the Pacific and mainland Asia. Each Zero was, in a sense, a work of artisanal craftsmanship, built with care and precision, but in numbers that could not match American production rates. The Americans built fighters the way they built automobiles, on assembly lines, with interchangeable parts, with systematic quality control that valued consistency over individual excellence. This was not an aesthetic triumph, but wars are not won by aesthetics. Sakai himself was grounded after another mission in June 1943 left him barely able to stand from accumulated injuries and strain. He spent much of the next year training new pilots, and here he encountered another dimension of Japan's deteriorating situation. The replacement pilots arriving at forward bases had a fraction of the training hours that Sakai's generation had received. In 1941, Japanese naval aviators had logged hundreds of hours of flight training before entering combat. By 1943, training had been shortened to conserve fuel and accelerate deployment. New pilots arrived with barely enough skill to land their aircraft safely, let alone survive combat against American pilots who were now flying superior aircraft and employing tactics refined by 2 years of analysis. The Americans, meanwhile, were improving not just their aircraft but their training systems. Pilot training in the United States emphasized not individual heroism, but systematic competence, navigation, gunnery, formation flying, tactical discipline. Pilots trained in aircraft similar to what they would fly in combat. They received instruction from combat veterans rotated home after completing tours of duty, ensuring that tactical lessons learned in the Pacific or Europe were rapidly disseminated. The system was not designed to produce samurai warriors, but competent professionals who could execute missions reliably. This difference in approach reflected deeper cultural assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. Japanese military doctrine, influenced by the bushidō tradition, tended to emphasize spiritual factors, fighting spirit, willingness to sacrifice, loyalty to the emperor. Material factors were not ignored, but they were subordinated to morale and determination. The famous Japanese war cry, Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, encapsulated this belief that superior will could overcome material disadvantage. It was a doctrine well suited to a resource-poor nation facing wealthy adversaries, but it contained a fatal flaw. It was empirically false. Courage and determination matter in warfare, but they do not violate the laws of physics. An aircraft that cannot reach the enemy's altitude cannot shoot them down, no matter how fierce the pilot's spirit. American military doctrine, emerging from a pragmatic and industrialized society, treated war as an engineering problem. Wars were won by logistics, by production, by systematic application of resources. Individual heroism mattered, but systems mattered more. This was not a philosophy that produced stirring poetry or dramatic propaganda, but it produced victory. The steady accumulation of material advantages, more ships, more aircraft, more trained personnel, more fuel, more ammunition, better intelligence, superior technology, eventually overwhelmed courage and determination. It was not inspiring, but it was decisive. By late 1943, the strategic situation had shifted irreversibly. American submarine warfare had severed Japanese supply lines throughout the Pacific. The island-hopping campaign was systematically capturing Japanese bases, pushing the defensive perimeter back toward the home islands. In the skies, American fighters, not just the P-47 but also the newer F-6F Hellcat and the P-38 Lightning, had achieved air superiority. Japanese pilots still fought with skill and determination, but they were fighting a losing battle against opponents who replaced losses faster than they could inflict them. Sakai, watching from training bases and occasionally flying defensive patrols over Japan itself, saw the evidence accumulating. American bombers appeared over Japanese cities with increasing frequency, flying at altitudes Japanese interceptors struggled to reach. The B-29 Superfortress, introduced in 1944, operated routinely above 30,000 feet, beyond the effective ceiling of most Japanese fighters. The Americans were not just winning the tactical battles, they were winning the technological competition that underpinned those battles. Each new American aircraft seemed to incorporate lessons from previous designs, to push performance further, to protect pilots better. The symbolic weight of the P-47 encounter lingered for Sakai throughout the war. In his later writings, he returned to it repeatedly, not as a discrete tactical event, but as the moment when the trajectory of the war became clear to him personally. He had spent 2 years as part of what seemed an invincible force, watching the rising sun's domain expand across Asia and the Pacific. In a handful of seconds over Rabaul, watching American fighters climb beyond his reach, that narrative collapsed. He understood, perhaps more clearly than his commanders in Tokyo, that Japan faced opponents who did not just possess greater resources, but who organized those resources with systematic efficiency towards strategic objectives. The contrast was most apparent in aircraft development timelines. The Zero had entered service in 1940 and remained Japan's frontline fighter, essentially unchanged through 1943. Improved variants were developed, but they represented incremental refinements rather than fundamental advances. The Americans, by contrast, were iterating rapidly. The P-47 that Sakai encountered in early 1943 was itself an evolution of earlier designs. It would be followed by improved models, the P-47D with increased range, the P-47M and P-47N with enhanced performance. Simultaneously, the Americans were developing and deploying entirely new fighters. The P-51 Mustang, perhaps the finest piston-engine fighter of the war, would achieve dominance in European skies, while Hellcats swept Japanese aircraft from Pacific carriers. This rapid iteration was possible only because of America's industrial depth. Designing a new aircraft requires not just engineers but wind tunnels, testing facilities, prototype workshops, pilots for test flights. Mass-producing that design requires factories, machine tools, trained workers, supply chains for thousands of components. The Americans possessed all of this in abundance and could afford to pursue multiple competing designs simultaneously, selecting the best performers for production. Japan, resource-constrained and fighting on multiple fronts, could not match this pace of innovation. The epilogue to Sakai's story contains the war's ultimate irony. He survived, one of relatively few Japanese pilots who lived through the entire conflict. His survival was partly luck, partly skill, but also partly a reflection that by war's end, Japan had so few functioning aircraft and so little fuel that even experienced pilots flew only occasionally. Sakai was in Japan when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was present for the surrender, and lived to see the American occupation. In the post-war years, Sakai became something unusual, a Japanese military veteran who spoke openly about his experiences without bitterness or revisionism. He met with former American pilots, including some who had fought against him. He corresponded with US Navy aviators, comparing experiences and perspectives. These encounters were often emotional, men who had tried to kill each other decades earlier, now sharing stories, recognizing in each other the universal experiences of fear, exhilaration, loss. But they also reinforced for Sakai the lessons he had begun to learn over Rabaul in 1943. In his memoir, published in 1957, Sakai reflected on the structural differences that had determined the war's outcome. He wrote with admiration bordering on awe about American industrial capacity, about the casual abundance that American forces enjoyed, about the systematic way that American military culture valued individual survival. He did not frame this as moral superiority. His pride in Japanese warrior traditions remained intact, but he acknowledged the empirical reality. The American system had proven more effective at prosecuting modern industrialized warfare. The recurring symbol in his post-war reflections was not the P-47 itself, but what it represented. A nation so wealthy, so industrially sophisticated, that it could afford to prioritize pilot survival, to build aircraft that were too heavy, to deploy them in numbers that seemed wasteful by Japanese standards. Sakai described his shock at learning after the war that American pilots had access to parachutes they could actually use. Japanese pilots technically had parachutes but were culturally discouraged from using them, bailing out being seen as cowardice. He described learning that American pilots who were shot down and survived were often rescued by dedicated air-sea rescue operations, flying boats and submarines specifically tasked with recovering downed airmen. Japan had no equivalent system. A pilot who went down in the ocean was generally left to die, not from callousness, but because the military simply lacked the resources for dedicated rescue operations. These details accumulated into a larger truth. The Americans had fought the war as if individual human lives mattered, as if returning pilots home alive was a strategic objective in itself rather than a fortunate bonus. This was not sentimentality but calculation. Trained pilots were valuable assets. Keeping them alive meant preserving their experience, their skills, their ability to train the next generation. The systematic way that American forces rotated combat veterans back home for rest, for training duties, for war bond tours, this too was part of the system. It maintained morale, disseminated tactical knowledge, and gave individual servicemen something to look forward to beyond death or victory. Japanese military culture had no framework for this approach. The ideal remained death in service to the emperor. Pilots who survived when their comrades died often felt profound shame. Survivors' guilt weaponized by cultural expectations. The logical endpoint of this philosophy was the kamikaze. Young pilots sent deliberately to die, their aircraft laden with explosives, their missions explicitly suicidal. To American observers this seemed fanatical, even insane. But within the internal logic of bushidō tradition, and Japan's desperate strategic situation by late 1944, it possessed a certain coherence. If pilots were going to die anyway, why not ensure their deaths inflicted maximum damage? The kamikaze attacks were tactically effective in some engagements, but strategically they accelerated Japan's defeat. Each kamikaze pilot represented hundreds of hours of training and irreplaceable human capital. Literally irreplaceable, since they died in their first and only mission. The Americans lost ships and men to kamikaze attacks, but they replaced them. Japan burned through its remaining trained pilots, and then its partially trained pilots, and then its barely trained boys, until by war's end there were essentially no Japanese aviators left and no fuel to fly them even if there had been. The larger truth that Sakai's experience illuminates is this. Wars between industrialized nations are not won primarily by superior warrior spirit or tactical brilliance, though both matter. They are won by systems, by the ability to produce, to transport, to maintain, to replace. The P-47 Thunderbolt climbing past Sakai's Zero that day over Rabaul was not just defeating a Japanese pilot, it was demonstrating the victory of one system over another. The American system built aircraft that were heavier, more complex, more expensive than necessary by Japanese standards, but that brought pilots home alive and dominated the skies. The Japanese system built aircraft that were elegant, efficient, and optimized for resource constraints, but that could not match American production or protect Japanese pilots. This was not a moral judgment, but a material fact. Different political and economic systems produce different capabilities. A democracy with a massive industrial base, vast natural resources, and a culture that values individual rights will approach warfare differently than a resource-poor authoritarian state with a warrior tradition emphasizing sacrifice. Neither approach is inherently superior in all contexts, but in the specific context of sustained industrialized warfare across the Pacific, the American system proved decisively more effective. The symbolism of altitude is difficult to miss. For centuries, military advantage came from seizing the high ground. Castles on hills, artillery on ridges, cavalry on elevated terrain. Air warfare extended this principle into the third dimension. The side that controlled altitude controlled engagement, could choose when to attack, could dive through enemy formations with gravitational assist, could break off combat by climbing away. Sakai had spent 2 years as the man with altitude advantage, looking down on adversaries from the superior heights that the Zero's climb rate provided. That encounter over Rabaul reversed the equation. He found himself looking up, unable to reach the enemy, unable to engage, unable to do anything but watch as American fighters operated in a realm beyond his aircraft's capabilities. The high ground had shifted, and with it the war. In the decades after the war, Sakai became a voice for reconciliation, speaking at military gatherings and historical symposiums, always returning to the same themes: the courage of individual pilots on both sides, the horror and waste of war, the respect that warriors should have for one another regardless of nationality. But he never shied from the material analysis. In interviews late in his life, he would emphasize that Japan lost not because Japanese pilots lacked courage, but because Japan lacked factories, oil, aluminum, industrial capacity. He would note that the finest individual pilot in the finest aircraft ever built cannot defeat 10 adequate pilots in adequate aircraft, because warfare is mathematics as much as heroism. This was, in its way, a more profound acknowledgement than a simple admission of defeat. Sakai was conceding that the entire framework within which Japanese military culture understood warfare, the emphasis on spirit, on individual heroism, on willingness to die, was incomplete. These factors mattered, but they were not decisive against an opponent who approached war as an industrial engineering problem to be solved through systematic application of resources. The American military did not ask its pilots to be samurai. It asked them to be professionals, competent and careful, and it gave them tools designed to maximize their effectiveness and survival. This was not as poetically compelling as Bushido, but it won the war. On January 17, 1943, 23,000 feet above Rabaul, Lieutenant Saburō Sakai learned a truth that would haunt Japanese strategic thinking for the remainder of the war: altitude cannot be seized through courage alone. The ceiling of the sky, he discovered, belonged not to the most skilled or the most determined, but to those whose engines breathed fire at heights where lesser machines gasped for air. It belonged to the nation whose factories could produce turbo superchargers by the thousands, whose supply ships crossed oceans laden with spare parts and fuel, whose pilots climbed into armoured cockpits knowing that their nation valued their survival as highly as their victory. The P-47 Thunderbolts that climbed past his Zero that morning were not merely aircraft. They were arguments made manifest in aluminum and steel, arguments about how industrial democracies wage war, about the relationship between individual and state, about whether warrior traditions can overcome production statistics. The argument was not settled by rhetoric or philosophy, but by performance measured in feet of altitude, rounds of ammunition, gallons of fuel, and most brutally, in the survival rates of pilots who flew home after missions versus those who did not. In his final years, Sakai would sometimes be asked by younger Japanese what lesson they should draw from the Pacific War. His answer was consistent: respect both courage and systems. Honor the warriors who fought with skill and determination, but understand that modern war is won by nations who can sustain production, who can train replacements, who can feed their soldiers and fuel their aircraft and repair their ships. A nation that sends starving pilots into the sky in unarmored aircraft to face well-fed opponents in machines designed to protect them has not understood the nature of contemporary warfare, no matter how fiercely those pilots fight. This is the lesson that climbed past Sakai's Zero on that crystalline January morning over the Pacific: that abundance matters, that industrial capacity matters, that systems matter. The Zero was a masterpiece of efficiency, but efficiency is what you pursue when you cannot afford sufficiency. The P-47 was a masterpiece of sufficiency, sufficient power, sufficient protection, sufficient armament, built in sufficient numbers by a nation that could afford to define the terms of engagement. It was heavy because weight did not matter when engines were powerful enough, It was armoured because pilot lives mattered more than saving aluminum. It could climb to 30,000 feet because American engineers had solved the turbo supercharger puzzle, and American factories could mass-produce the solution. The sky above Rabaul that day was clear and blue and infinite, but Saburō Sakai had discovered its ceiling. Not the absolute ceiling, the point where the atmosphere becomes too thin for any aircraft, but the ceiling of his own capability, the upper limit of what his aircraft could reach. Above him, American pilots flew in realm he could not access, and in that simple geometric fact was written the outcome of the war. The high ground belonged to those who built machines capable of reaching it, and the machines were built by a nation whose wealth and industry allowed it to protect its warriors even as it armed them. It was not a lesson Sakai wished to learn, but it was the lesson the sky taught him, as it would teach every Japanese pilot who survived long enough to understand. The war would continue for more than 2 years after that January morning, and Sakai would fly again, and men would die on both sides with courage and skill. But the fundamental equation had been established in those seconds, when the Thunderbolts climbed beyond his reach. Japan could produce warriors, but America could produce everything else.